So actually, I'm combining both administrative position and studies and academics. I recently submitted to a print book, which is called Global History of Ukraine. It's a very modest project. And basically, I'm going to tell the very short, short version of this book. And I feel myself between the rock and hard place, because I don't really know you, and I don't know what do you really know about Ukraine? I presume some of you know even better than me. Some of you not have a sufficient, knowledge. So I have to cover some middle of the road, so to say, middle way. I will talk some probably very simple facts, but I will try to provide some kind of the broader interpretation of these facts. So first of all, if I may suggest you, okay, my presentation is frozen. So if I may suggest you the best book on Ukrainian history. Okay, so let me see what I can do here. Okay. So if I am suggest you best book on Ukrainian history, the criterion is very simple. The shorter, the better. So the shortest version of Ukrainian history was written by this man, Yaroslav Hrytsak. And this version, short text, is exactly called Ukraine between East and West. It's 6 pages. It's probably the best synthesis of Ukrainian history. Very sophisticated and very simply put, so to say. And basically what I'm trying to do now today is just provide some footnotes to this text. But I would encourage you strongly to find this book and to read this text. If you won't find this book, I could send you print of this copy of this article. And anyway, do read it because it's a nice piece, so to say. So basically, it's Yaroslav Hrytsak. It's from his book Essays on Modern Ukrainian History, and a very short the essay that opens the book, which is called Ukraine between East and West. So basically, we understand that East and West, North and South is not a geographical concept in this case. It's more than a geography. It's broader geography and political and cultural concepts, so to say. So then we have to just define what we mean by the East. So in Ukrainian case, there are 2 Easts, so to say. If I say so, 2 Easts. So the first one is the east of the steppe. My son, when I was in Fulbright in the United States, he was attending high school, and he one day returned from the high school and said that he has made discovery. He found out the new formula. What is the difference between Ukrainian and American history? So basic difference is that America has the Wild West and Ukraine has the Wild East. So the East is the steppe. Steppe, it's a huge strip. It's a huge strip that unites Europe and Asia and starts somewhere in Manchuria, goes through Mongolia, then south of nowadays Russia and Kazakhstan, and then make a turn to Ukraine and ends in Pannonia. Pannonia is nowadays Hungary. So think about the steppe as a huge highway for nomads. So this was at least from the 6th century. We know this is kind of the highway from the nomads migrating from east to west. Goths, Visigoths, Alans, Avars, and most importantly, Mongols and Tatars, who made a strong impact on the local history in a sense that they destroyed the capital and the early state in this territory, which was called Rus. But the basic rule was very simple, rule of thumb. So basically, this is territory until the end of 18th century of the very intensive interaction between the settled territory and the steppe. The settled territory was mainly presented by the agrarians, mostly peasants, who were tilling their lands, and the steppe mostly by the nomads, who were living in the south of this territory. And the rule of the thumb was that most of the time their interactions were not peaceful. And within this warlike interaction, until the end of 15th century, it was nomads who tend to win over the agrarians. let me put this way, that this territory until the end of the 18th century has been known as the source for slaves, Eastern European slaves, mostly from nowadays lands of the Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. And they were brought on the Mediterranean markets exactly by the nomads, which actually was, there was like a human hunting. They were hunting these agrarians, poor people, poor creatures, and bringing to the, turning him the slave and bringing him the Mediterranean markets. So basically, this is the story, which gives you again the idea about the history. It's a very dramatic, sometimes very traumatic history, so to say. Violence is a norm, so to say, for most of the days. But until the 18th century, it was mostly a conflict between agrarians and the nomads. Not that much east and west, but rather south, which are nomads, and north, which is agrarian society. Just to give you an idea about the size, the sheer size of this interaction, the capital city of the Kyiv, capital city of Ukraine, Kyiv, which was the capital of the earliest largest state on this territory, Rus or Kyiv Rus. At the height of its development, it was among the 10 largest cities in Europe. But then destroyed by the Tatars in 1240, it was relegated, reduced to a small provincial town until the end of the 19th century. Only by the end of the 19th century, it started to say restore its former status and size. In this sense, you can compare fate or history of Kyiv to the fate or history to the ancient Rome, which was the largest city in Europe as imperial capital, but then destroyed by the barbarians of the north, and regained its status only by the 19th century. And in a sense, yeah, Italian history is very much dramatic, very much like Ukrainian history in the sense of the intensity on the conflicts. But the basic fact is that this factor of the East has a very dramatic impact on the local history, in a sense that local population has to use a lot of the energy for defending their territories. And they were losing this energy, so not to focusing that much on the culture, on the politics, because the issue of the security was always on the top. So just give you some kind of the idea about this fact. And just to show you the picture how this interaction was developing over time between forest and steppe, settled territory and nomad territory. So this is the earliest one, which is the territory of the core of the Rus state. Then you see it's changing. It's now it's retreat. And basically the state, this story ends by the end of 18th century, when the steppe and Crimean Tatar Khanate was annexed by the Russian state. And this opened a new page in the history of Eastern Europe and also in history on Ukraine. So since the 19th century, since the 18th century, we have a very intense colonization of the steppe. Before that, it was called wild steppe or the wild east. It was very dangerous to be settled there. So not many people dare to live there. So actually, it's not quite a desert, but it was a bit underpopulated. Since the end of 18th century, since the time of the annexation of this steppe by the Russian Empire, it became a normal territory, and it opened a space, opened a window for a large and very intensive colonization, which again could be compared to colonization, to economic story of the United States in the 19th century. In very intense colonization, most of the industrial sites, new industrials emerged there, specifically Donbass. It's a very much 19th century phenomenon. Also, it attracted a population from all parts of the world. It was extremely diverse population. It was German Mennonites, French aristocrats, Italian, Jewish, Armenian, Greek merchants, military Serbian settlers, but most importantly, there were Ukrainian peasants who moved from the north. Since they were suffered from the land hunger, they found a new huge space to colonize, and they moved in large numbers. So until the end of the 19th century, the majority of population here were made by the Ukrainian peasants. And it resulted in the extension of Ukrainian ethnic territory. Basically, there is a very strong explicit dividing timeline between old and new Ukraine. Old Ukraine, the one that existed before the 18th century, Ukraine for the north. And since the 19th century, new Ukraine, which also included the south part, the steppe. It was twice as large as the previous Ukraine. And also because this territory was also part of Russian Empire, its identity was very ambivalent. It was neither Ukrainian nor Russian. Basically, Russians thought about this territory as a new Russia, but factually it was new Ukraine, giving the ethnic composition of this territory. And again, you could easily guess what is the source of the nowadays Russian-Ukrainian conflicts, because Russians still tends to see this territory as a new Russia. But in terms of the Ukrainian history, this territory became a place for a very rapid industrialization. As I mentioned, the Donbass, but more specifically, the center in the Katanoslav, nowadays Dnipro, which was the largest industrial center at that time, and also urbanization. The other story, which should be mentioned here, the difference between division between the old Ukraine and new Ukraine is also division between the old cities and new cities. Say Lviv, the city where we have our Catholic University, was the largest city of the old Ukraine. I have to note that Kyiv at that time was a small provincial town. So Lviv was the largest city until the end of 18th century. And since the end of 19th century, most of the largest city, they emerged in the steppe zone. First of all, Odessa. Since the end of 18th century, Odessa until the end of 19th century becomes the largest city in Ukraine, the third largest city in Russian Empire. So this is kind of a new dividing line between old Ukraine and new Ukraine. It also has a kind of cultural dimension, since most of the population in the east was extremely diverse, unlike in the north. They were assimilated into Russian culture, Russian language by the end of 18th century, 19th century. So nowadays, since Ukraine, since the independent Ukraine inherited both this territory, you have a kind of the fundamental division between old Ukraine and new Ukraine, which is also division between Ukrainian-speaking West and Russian-speaking East. You could probably draw a parallel here between Belgium and Italy, which is also divided in similar way. But again, as I say, that this is probably much strong divide than Belgium and or Italy, because it's also superimposed over the religious divisions. The West is mostly Greek Catholic, and the East is mostly Orthodox, either Moscow Orthodox or Kyiv Orthodox. But basically, historically, it's a different religious territory. So they put this way, that by the 1993, when Ukraine faced its first political crisis, the CIA came with prognosis that Ukraine is driving to civil war between Russian-speaking East and Ukrainian-speaking West. The war that, in comparison with Yugoslav war, would look like an innocent picnic. This I'm quoting verbatim. It gives you an idea about intensity of the conflict. You probably know a book of the Clash Civilization by Samuel Huntington, and Samuel Huntington provides Ukraine as a classical example to call cleft country, which is divided in these two parts. And basically, most of the elections, most of the political crises, it exactly developing along this line, so-called Kharkiv-Uman, the line which divides Ukraine in two. Put it very simply, probably simplified, the first Ukraine is a pro-Maidan, the second Ukraine is anti-Maidan. But again, it's very simplified because it's now dissipating, especially after Russian aggression in 2014 after Maidan. So this is a kind of complicated story, but if I may some wrap up, the main conclusion is that regionalism was and still is an extremely persistent factor in Ukrainian history. Ukraine is very strongly divided. There are many divisions, but the main one is division between West and East. It has a negative impact because of this kind of the division. Ukraine is suffering crisis, numerous crises, actually Ukraine is developing from crisis to a crisis. But still, the positive fact is that most of the time, more often than not, Ukrainian elites tend to compromise because they do realize disastrous effects of this crisis. And I would say that also some kind of the unforeseen result is that this division, regionalism, serves as a backbone for Ukrainian democracy. It's you don't have this kind of regionalism in Poland, in Russia, or Belarus, because Russia and Belarus, they largely homogenized, in the unlike Ukraine. So basically, since Ukraine has that much strong religion, the divisions, nobody could run Ukraine single-handedly. You have to strike a compromise, different regional elites. And compromise is as I may say so, is a bread and wine of democracy. So what I say, regionalism is to a large extent responsible for democracy. I would say it's a particular kind of democracy by default. But anyway, it provides a distinction why Ukraine is that much different, and its kind of political developments that much different from Russia and Belarus, because Ukraine tends to be a democratic state, because of many factors, but one of the factors is kind of the geography multiplied by politics. So I would stop here, and since I tend to have a long monologues, I would probably ask you for some comments or questions that we could just stop for a while and to probably have some kind of dialogue, if I may. Do we, Matthew, raise the hand. Please go ahead, Matthew, if I may.
Hello, sorry my camera's not on right now, but so I was just looking up and I believe like the percentage of Greek Catholics is around 10% or so. Correct me if I'm wrong, but were you saying that sort of everyone in the West predominantly is Greek Catholic, or is it dispersed throughout the country?
It's very much dispersed. Thank you so much, Matthew, for the question. Actually, to tell that Western Ukraine is Greek Catholic, it's a very much oversimplified picture. Actually, it's Huntington that use this way, because basically Greek Catholic is basically it's Galicia and Transcarpathia, some part. But I would say that Western part is very diversified, but along with the Greek Catholics, it has a very strong presence of Protestants, historical Protestants, coming from Germany and Czech, especially Volhynia. So in this sense, it's also different because the old Ukraine, Western part, has the old Protestants, while the new Ukraine has the new Protestants, most Americans Protestant who came there very much later. But basically, to put it very simply and short, yes, Western Ukraine is very much diverse as the other part of Ukraine, but it's diverse in different ways, since it has a large Greek Catholic population. And Greek Catholic population is very evident because it's much more politically mobilized. Giving the, I will tell it later, so you'll see them more often than not, both in Kyiv, on Maidan, and like that, so to say. Is there any other question? If not, so let me proceed further. So there's a East number 2, which is kind of bizarre East, because it's basically not East, it's a South. It's a Byzantium. It's a Byzantium, but basically Byzantium, we probably know that there has been no such a stand as Byzantine Empire. It's a name that was coined by the German historians to make a distinction from the old Roman Empire. It's a new Roman Empire, so to put it. New Roman Empire, which emerged since the collapse, since the fall of the Rome. And the Romans transferred their capital from Rome to Constantinople, which was made on the base of the former Greek colony Byzantium. So therefore it's called Byzantium state. But basically they believed themselves to be Romans. They were Greek speaking, they called them Romei, but basically they consider themselves to be the Roman state, the Roman Empire, and it existed until the middle of the 15th century, until it was conquered by the Turks. But basically the story is that this was the empire that was very close to the Slavic territory, to Slav Eastern Europe, and provided a huge impact on this territory, most of all because it provided Christianity. The local Christianity is actually Byzantine Christianity, unlike the Western Europe that accepted Christianity from the Rome. Majority of the local population, Slavic population, and plus Bulgarian and plus Romanians and Moldovians, they gained the Christianity from Byzantium. And this, until now, had a very strong impact on the track of history on this territory. And I try to explore shortly about this, briefly about this impact. So let me start from the kind of digression. We tend to see Ukraine as a part of East European land history, East European region, which is true. But Ukraine belongs to more than one region. The oldest region is actually Mediterranean civilization. The story is that Crimea and the border seaboards of the steppe, they were part of the Mediterranean civilization. They expanded so far from Gibraltar to Caucasus. And you see here the Greek colonies, and many of these Greek colonies are exactly on this territory. So basically looking for the beginning of the written history of this territory, you have to search for the Herodotus, because the first description of this territory was provided by Herodotus in the 5th century, the 5th century before the Christ. So it's a very ancient history, so I'm trying to say here. And the many kind of concepts of the nowadays Eastern European history actually was borrowed from this Byzantium or Roman civilization. One example is Little and Great Russia. Little Russia is a synonym of the Ukraine, and Great Russia is a synonym of Russia. And quite often it's treated that great means size, that since Russia is larger than Ukraine, therefore it's a Great Russia, and therefore by definition, Ukraine is a Little Russia. Sometimes also treated as a kind of who has the main rights for this territory. Great Russia has all this so-called oldest state, and therefore has a kind of monopoly of this territory. And this is wrong reading of these terms, because it's very contemporary readings. In the ancient times, great, big and small, or large and minor, has a quite different meaning. You see here on the map, the territory of small Greece. Small Greece means a core from which the colonization and civilization expanded. And the neighboring territory was called large Greece. So basically, you could find this in many languages, many territories. You have a small Poland in center in Krakow, and Great Poland in center in Warsaw, which means that Krakow was an initial capital of the Polish state. So basically, talking about the great Ukraine and Russia, it's probably the same pattern. the small Russia or mini Russia means that civilization meant Christianity, emerged in this territory. It was a core, and from this core it expanded further to the large expansion of the Russian Empire and the Orthodox world. In this kind of connections, geography, Ukrainian part, I'm talking Ukrainian part contemporary times, but basically it's Crimea and Black Sea shore played a very peculiar role. It was Roman Siberia or Australia. It was a place for prisoners or for kind of the natural jail, so to put it. And one of the first was the Pope Clementus I. He was sent to Crimea. He was banished to Crimea, and actually he died there of martyr death, which is kind of story. And this is a very strong, there's a very kind of the, how should I say, popular myth of Clementus I. It's another story. I wouldn't get into the story because the story is very long, but make this long story short. The cult of Clementus is very popular among the Ukrainians, Russian, Belarusians. And you probably know the story that our Ukrainian Catholic University, the first suggestion was to name it after this Clementus I, because he was the first Pope who was on this territory. But basically, the story is that this myth, like Christianity, emerged on this territory through interactions from the Crimea and Black Sea, through Byzantium. So in a sense, Byzantium provided civilization. When civilization means not a kind of the, how to say, the value judgment, but something which has a cities, which has a writing system, has a text philosophy, all the kind of things. And therefore, the main dividing line in early modern history was not east-west, but north-south. South was a central civilization, or South meant civilization. This basically was Roman Empire. And North was basically barbarian European tribes. And the Christianity expanded from the south to the north. And exactly on this line, south-north, there emerged a first state, large state in this territory, which is called Rus. Sometimes it's called Kiev Rus, or very often, but it's also kind of the invented name. They never called Kiev name, it was invented in the 19th century. The main name is Rus. There is a lot of discussion what Rus really means, but to make a long story short, it's mostly Scandinavian name, because the first elites of this territory were big Vikings or Normans who were looking for new trade routes from north to south, initially to Baghdad, which has a rich repository of silver, and later on to Constantinople. So they were passing through this territory from north to south. This is called trade route from Greeks to Varech, Шлях з Варяги у Греки. And along this north line, north-east-south line, there emerged a state with the center of Kyiv. It was extremely diverse state, multicultural, multilingual, polyethnic, name it. Basically, the elites were Scandinavian, which were assimilated in 3-4 generations. The majority population were Slavic. The population north was Hungarian Finnish tribes. On the south were steppe tribes. So the reason I'm telling this, because there's a lot of controversy nowadays still going on, because both Ukrainians and Russians claim that this is their states. This is called a national state, which is a nonsense, because at that time there was no national state, and secondly, it was not uninational, so to say. It was not homogeneous. It's extremely heterogeneous state. I would say that you could compare the state with another state of this size and importance. It is empire of the Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. which gave a birth to French, German, Italian nation lately. So in the same sense, you could say that Rus state served as a cradle for Belarusian, Ukrainians, and Russian, but nobody could claim as their national state. So, but basically the story is, it was the largest empire in this part of the world, which existed until the 13th century, until it was crushed by the Mongol Tatars. But even so, this empire ceased to exist, there is a long shadow of this empire, and the long shadow means basically Byzantium influences. I would like to have a look on this table. This is human development indices. I believe it's probably 205, but basically I could make a new one, but basically we see the same pictures. So you could see the ranking of the post-communist countries, and you could clearly see the dividing line. The most countries which is of the Roman heritage, so to say, Catholics or Protestants, they fare much better than all the countries of the Orthodox or Byzantium legacy. You could see the kind of difference between Latvia and Belarus is dividing line. So the old Europe, the Catholic Europe, which also has the kind of communist state like Slovenia, Hungary, Czech Republic, fares much better than the former Byzantium or Rus legacy. So basically the story is that the countries of the former Byzantium legacy, and also I have to emphasize that it's not just Slavic countries, but also Romania and Moldova, and also Greek. They fare worse in terms that they have a lower level of trust, higher level of corruption, and there is a strong tendency to authoritarianism. It's a long discussion among the historians, political scientists, why is that? Again, I wouldn't go to the discussion, but I probably just quote the words by Alexander Kazhdan, who was leading Byzantine scholar, who worked most of his life in Soviet Union, but then as a Russian Jew who was allowed to emigrate to United States, and he finished his career as a Harvard professor. And he tried to sum up his career, long career, and said basically that when I think about Byzantium impact, I basically keep returning to the same thought, that Byzantium left us a unique totalitarian European totalitarianism. So that in some way, basically, the Byzantium legacy is synonymous, equanimous to the tolerant experience in this part of the world. And without the recognition of this simple fact, we could not hardly recognize our place in the world history. Again, it's a very much disputed point, but basically the story is that many people say that it's no coincidence that communism emerged exactly in this space of the former Byzantium legacy. They call it Slavia Orthodoxa, Orthodox Slavs, which is not correctly termed, but it's not Slavs, as I mentioned again, it's also Romans or the Romani in Moldavia. But basically nowadays in Russia, Kremlin propaganda, particularly Putin, claimed the space as Ruski Mir, Russian world, and basically claimed it's a kind of separate civilization, which has to develop differently than the West, which means it could be illiberal, it could crash the democratic rights, civic institution, LGBT, all the kind of things, so to say. So basically, again, this old legacy is now turned into controversy, which has a effect in political and only in military sense, because basically the story is the Ukraine, since the independence, tried to leave the space, Ruski Mir, while Russia tried to hold the monopoly of the space, Ukraine included. So what I'm saying here, that these events, which has a 1,000-year record, still have impact, exercise influence on this history, and very strongly so. That said, I have to make a caveat, a very strong caveat. First of all, many historians, me included, believe that the impact of Byzantium is very much exaggerated. In many senses, probably will emerge in questions, in answers, with which you have this kind of time for this. But basically, if you look on this simple map, it's a map of marriages of cave princes since the end of 19th till the 13th century. So majority, overwhelming majority of these marriages were with the countries to the west: Poland, Norwegian, Sweden, France, Germany, even Italy, definitely Hungary, and some cases even England. So basically what I'm saying here, that historically and culturally, Rus belonged to the European space, and there is no strict division between East and West, between Catholic and Orthodox European Orthodox civilization. It comes much later, because on the everyday level is not that much felt, or not that much felt. So I would say that Rus, since it collapsed in the 13th century, the territory which inherited the Rus legacy could move different ways. There are many scenarios. Like there is a city which nobody now remember as a large city, as one of the capital was Novgorod on the north, which has a very strong republican traditions and very close to the west. If the Novgorod would not be crushed by Moscow in the 15th century, most likely that there will be not one but two Russian nations, one of some Novgorod type, the other Moscow type. And this Novgorod type is much more Western than the Moscow type, so to say. Again, saying the history roots here is never simple. The history never runs simply here in this case. But actually, so I'm saying there are many scenarios. Some of but the real drama, or even say the tragedy, that in the final result, by the end of the day, among the many scenarios, it was the scenarios of Moscow kingdom or princedom, who later turned to the Russian Empire. And this was the scenario that turned to be victorious. And the drama is that was the least geographically and culturally related with Europe. So therefore, in the discourses, political discourses, or cultural discourses, in these territories, at least from the 17th century, they're still discussing whether they are or not the part of the Europe. And some say liberal intellectuals still claim that they are returning to Europe as they are not Europe, so to say. But basically, this is the story because of the exactly of the victory of this scenario. Again, I will stop here, and I would ask you for questions and comments, if I may. So far, I don't see any raised hand. So if I'm really bad in the presentations, so if you don't have any questions, which means I'm basically failing with my presentation.
And I just have a quick question here. Sorry, my screen isn't working either. So you were saying that Ukraine's role is somewhat exaggerated, that its size is basically a marriage, as you said, between various powers. Do you see Ukraine perhaps playing an actual larger political role in the years to come by virtue of its being this coagulation, as it were, of different influences and different powers?
I would say so. My imagination, my idea, my prophecy is that Ukraine could serve as a perfect bridge between East and West. It's west of the East and east of the West, so to say. But it could play this role only on the condition that it would ever come to Russian-Ukrainian reconciliation. My point would be here that I believe this Russian-Ukrainian constellation will play such a role for the expanded Europe or creation of new Europe, like it was French-German constellation in the Western Europe in the 50s, which basically created European Union. So what I'm saying here that this Russian-Ukrainian border or Russian-Ukrainian interaction makes a very important geopolitical pivot, and it exercises an impact, I would say large impact, on the shape of European politics and also probably to some extent into global politics. One way or another, this Ukrainian issue is a part nowadays of the global issue and has to be resolved. I'm not claiming that Ukraine is kind of, the very important, the most important place. I'm claiming that Ukraine is one of the major geopolitical chessboards. I used to compare to my students Ukraine with Palestine. Palestine is relatively small territory with very long record of the conflicts, and these conflicts, local in Palestine, exercise a large effect on the European politics. I would say that Ukraine is 19th, 20th century Palestine in this sense. So I'm saying again, Ukrainian issue is not a Ukrainian issue, it's a larger issue. And the most important point was whether Ukraine could play a role as an object or as a subject. Because before that, Ukrainian issue was resolved without Ukrainians and at their cost. So basically, the real challenge nowadays is to gain the status of subjectivity, so to say, not to participate in the resolving of European conflict or a global conflict as a kind of equal partner, so to say. Are there any other questions? I'm sorry.
Bogdan raised his hand.
Bogdan, yes, go ahead, Paul.
I have a question about impact of Byzantine culture and Christianity on Ukraine. I remembered a well-known phrase of poet Vasilius about atheistic or passive spirit of Orthodoxy. He wrote that I don't like Christianity because of the passive spirit of Byzantine Orthodoxy, and accepting Christianity from Byzantine Empire was a great mistake for Ukrainians. So how can you comment these words? I understand that Stus wasn't a professional historian and Byzantologist, but this observation is very interesting, and it's very interesting.
So, thank you so much, Bogdan, for a question. Sometimes poet could have a better vision, larger vision than historians or any kind of scientist. I would say that Stus was basically right and wrong. Right in the way that there is something in the Byzantium legacy which turned this region into some kind of backward region, politically and economically. But put it other words, it's anachronistic, because in the time when the Kiev Rus accepted Christianity, it was choice without the choice, because Byzantium was the only civilization at that time. Rome at that time was a peripheral, provincial city, so to say. And since Rus was in very close contact, in the closest contact with Byzantium, it will be very much strange that would agree to accept Christianity from the far and provincial Rome than from the splendid Constantinople, so to say. What I'm saying here, that probably one of the biggest drama of the local history was the demise of Byzantium Empire. We don't know what would happen with Byzantium, will it exist longer. Let's give me an example, Japan. Japan was also very much like Byzantine Empire with the kind of dictatorial legacies, with a very small impact in the natural sciences, so forth, so forth. But then in the 19th century, Japan was radically modernized and raised to the status of the large superpower. We never know what will happen with Byzantium. It will exist much more longer. So I say that Byzantium is a kind of the, how should I say, is a victim of a black legend, very much so. And less we know, the more is the link, the bigger is the legend, so to say. So basically I'm saying it's not the Byzantium per se. It's a Byzantium legacy as it was inherited by the Muscovite Tsardom. This is really a problem. If we will have a Kievan version of Byzantium legacy or Novgorod version of Byzantium legacy, most likely the local history would run quite differently. But this is what we have nowadays. I will develop this thesis point later on, this kind of political implications. So I would stop this question and answers part now and proceed further, hoping that we'll have a more question and answers on the final point. So now we're coming to the West. The West is the only one West. There's no two Easts. Basically, West is a Christian Europe, Catholic Europe. But again, in this case, particular case, mostly West mean Poland and Polish influences. As a very famous Byzantologist, Shevchenko, put it, that West came in Ukraine in Polish clad or in Polish clothes. Because basically, Rzeczpospolita Polish state was the largest Catholic state in the East, which has a large chunk of Ukrainian Orthodox territories. And this interaction between Catholicism of Polish kind and local Ukrainian Orthodox Byzantium style, where Ukrainian has emerged. Let me just tell you another high point, another dimension, that we tend to see Ukrainian history in the shadow of the Russia and Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. It's true for the last 2 centuries, 19th, 20th century, until the end of 18th century. The largest impact on this territory was made by Polish state, by Polish culture, because historically Polish factor in Ukraine was much longer and much stronger than Russian. Just give you the idea that by the end of the 19th century, the majority, 75% of the local nobility were Poles or Polish origin. And since at that time, Polish nobility had the high culture, which could exercise a very strong impact on the local culture and local territory. Just give you the idea, if you look on the nowadays map of Ukraine, and if you draw the lines of the intensity of Polish aggression or Drang nach Osten, this is the first one, which is Galicia, when the Polish influences were the longest one, the strongest one, since the middle of the 19th century until the First World War, literally for the 6th century. So this is the mostly Polish influenced territory. Then there's the central territory in Volhynia, which came under Polish impact only in the middle of the 16th century, and here impact was 250 years. And then the third territory, Forum Cossack territory, which has only 100, the record of Polish history, and steppe, which is 0. So if you put these lines on nowadays map of Ukraine, you would easily see the zones of intensity of Ukrainian language. The mostly intense Ukrainian territory is Galicia, followed by the central Ukraine and Volhynia, and then north of Ukraine. Also, the intensity of Ukrainian identity. I'm not saying that Poles has invented Ukrainian language. No, far from it. But what I'm saying here, the Poles brought some of the Western concepts. And among these concepts was the republic, democracy, nationalism, which is basically very much a Western concept through the Polish mediation. Let me give you one example. It's probably sound funny. You wonder if you know the Polish anthem. It starts with the word "Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła." The Poland has not perished yet. You would be surprised that Ukrainian anthem starts with the same quote, "Ще не вмерла Україна." But more than that, there is a third anthem, which starts with the same line. Our hope has not perished. Guess which anthem is that? Israel. And why is that? Because the author of this Israel anthem was born in the vicinity of Lviv, which is under strong Polish impact. So I'm saying that in many senses, Poland was teaching them a new languages, modern languages, no language of the liberalism, democracy, nationalism, name it. But basically, it was a Western concept, but it came from the medium of the Polish state. Polish state was largely anomaly. You don't have that much states in the history of Europe or even in the world. First of all, the first anomaly, it was both republic and monarchy. The whole name, the same name, Rzeczpospolita, the name of the state, was translated as Respublika. It's a Polish rendering of the Respublika, Rzeczpospolita. But then again, there's monarchy, but the king was elected, like in the democratic procedures. It's elected by nobility. Nobility made that 10% of the population, which is exceedingly higher percent. In normal countries, the rate of the nobility was 1–2% maximum. In Polish state, it was a 10. So every 10 citizen or every 10 person in Polish state was a noble. We have to discuss it. Probably close to that would be Hungary and Spain, which also has a high number, but not that high number, not the high as in Poland. And this nobility it enjoyed unprecedented privileges and rights. More specifically, they elected the king and they limited its power. Its power, actually, king was handicapped by nobility, and they said that he ruled but not governed. He governed but not ruled. He was not a ruler. It was like a CEO nowadays. Time you could put it. And also, what's an anomaly, in the sense that Rzeczpospolita, Polish state, at least at the first century of its existence, was known on the religious tolerance. First of all, the Jews, which were expelled from the most Catholic countries, including Spain, by that time Catholic England or Germany, they found a refuge in Rzeczpospolita, in these territories. And basically they tend to settle themselves on the east, which is Belarus, Lithuania, Ukrainian territory. But basically, until the beginning of the First World War, the largest Jewish population in the world was exactly on this territory, on the eastern parts of the former Polish state. Why is that? Because Poland was known of this religious tolerance, and they actually welcomed Jews very much so. And Poland was called a paradise for Jews, comparing to other countries. Secondly, and more importantly, Rzeczpospolita, or Polish state, was the largest state, early modern state, where you have the two large confessions represented by equal numbers, Catholics and Orthodox. It's exactly where West and East has met, and intensely so. More specifically on territories nowadays, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. So it kind of provided, some strong impact, but it was not a kind of very peaceful coexistence. You could easily imagine there was a lot of conflicts, especially in both Orthodox and Catholics. And one of the results of the conflict was the emergence of our church, Greek Catholic, which is a Greek or not Catholic, we just Orthodox who accepted the supremacy of the Pope. But basically, the story is, if you somehow made a digression from the religion issue to political legacies, one of the main impact of Rzeczpospolita was political traditions. And these political traditions was typically Western. Western, I meant by the vision of the secular and religious sphere. You don't have this tradition like in Byzantium, when emperor was also head of the church, so-called tradition of Caesaropapism, very much like a later Russia, the Russian Empire. And this division of power between secular religious spheres. When emperor and pope, they were equal and nobody could command each other, it resulted in the very different patterns of political traditions. In a sense, when you have two powers, religious and secular, there is a large space for the third part to emerge, which not could be strictly controlled neither by secular nor religious power. Exactly a space when you have some autonomous institution emerging, like universities, like cities, autonomous cities, like some these institutions. And I would say this is probably the strongest impact that Rzeczpospolita has on these territories, because we have a very strong historical memory and more often and very often practice of these civic institutions, which are independent both from the state and from the church, so to say, the third actor, which could be nowadays terms called the civil society. In the Russian Empire or in the Ottoman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, the chances for emergence of this actor was very slim, since the two power tends to how to say it, submerge or to emerge in each other. There was hardly an independent space for emergence of independent actor, autonomous institutions. So many historians, political scientists believe that this provides a crucial difference between the Orthodox and the Catholic world. By Catholic also mean the later Protestant world. So therefore they run very much different political ways since the 16th, 17th, 17th century. But then, if you look again in Ukraine, Ukraine is neither here or there, because it's both here or there. And probably the best way to illustrate this synthesis is to look at the symbol, main symbol of Ukrainian identity, which are Ukrainian Cossacks. Cossacks, there has been a military organizations which emerge everywhere on the borderland between the steppe and the forest. You have a Russian Cossacks, like in Don or in Ural Cossacks, and also Ukrainian Cossacks. But there is crucial differences between Ukrainian and Russian Cossacks. In a sense, they could easily write Russian history without the Cossacks. You cannot write Ukrainian history without the Cossacks, because in Ukrainian history, Cossack is the central element of identity. While in Russian history, it's mostly the state history, История государства российского. Ukraine could never hardly write the history of Ukrainian state, so therefore they write history from below. In a sense, the Russian history is writing from above, state, not the society. Ukrainian history is writing from below, which is basically Cossacks as a main symbol. So what is the particular about the Cossacks? They were probably the best epitome of this kind of the synthesis between East and West. First of all, they emerged on the front line, on the borderlands between the nomads and the agrarian territories. And as I said, since until the at least end of 15th century, military, the Muslim steppe societies, they controlled, they were superior toward in military sense to the settled agrarian societies. So therefore, to fight against the Turks, Ottomans, Cossack has to accept their military tactics organization. So if you look on the picture of Cossacks, they look like typically nomads. And actually the name Cossacks is actually third term. Cossacks mean free man or bandit, so to say. So basically the rule is very simple. If you're fighting against the enemy which is stronger, the safest way to overcome is to borrow his weapon or his way of life, so to say. So therefore, basically, Cossacks were emulating the nomads' ways of life. But that time, they were Orthodox. So there was Orthodox nomads, and more than that, they modeled themselves as a model of Polish Szlachta, Polish nobility. Since the Polish nobility has unprecedented rights and privileges, Cossack also wanted to have these Cossack privileges, and this cited as a pretext for a numerous Cossack-Polish war, because basically Cossacks want to establish them as a new nobility on the borderland of Rzeczpospolita. And finally, this was not a typically Cossacks in the sense like a Russian Don or Ural Cossack, because their elites were very much educated. Most of their elites were educated in the Jesuit colleges, like Bogdan Khmelnytsky, Ivan Mazepa, which means they spoke Latin, they know rhetoric, poetry, music, all the kind of things. In a sense, they were educated in the Western style according to the standards of the 16th, 17th century. So what I'm saying here, it's everywhere here. It's both nomads, Orthodox, and it's both East, West, and Orthodox civilization. What I'm saying here, that they serve as epitome of the West synthesis of West and East, as Ukraine is, in a sense, kind of hybrid identity. And to make a long story short, in 1648, the Cossacks succeeded to separate from Poland, create the overstate, and united with the Russian Empire. And it's open a new picture or new page in the history of Eastern Europe, in a sense that local elites, Ukrainian elites, contributed very much to the emergence of Russia as a world empire. They were like a Scots of Russian Empire in the 18th, 19th century. They played an enormous role because they were very much educated, especially in Petersburg. There was a colony, so-called colony of Little Russians. And since the corruption was very high, you could hardly get a position in this Petersburg without kind of the permission or connection with the Little Russian colony. It ceased to exist in the 19th century when local Polish Ukrainian elites were replaced by German, Baltic Germans. And since then, in the 19th century, Russian Empire was called a German Empire. But still, in cultural terms, many Ukrainians or Little Russians, they contributed to Russian culture, like Anton Chekhov, who called themselves lazy Malo-Russian, or Dostoevsky, or Mayakovsky, name it. There are such large numbers of the people of Ukrainian origin that nobody could really trace it. But basically, I'm saying here that to a large extent, irony is that the Russian Empire was very much also Ukrainian Empire, because Ukraine very much contributed to this empire. This is to also repeated himself in the Soviet Empire under Brezhnev, when the local Ukrainian elites play enormous role in the ruling of the empire. So what I'm saying here, that this sense, Ukraine Cossacks made a backbone Ukrainian identity. This backbone was very ambivalent. On the one sense, it was very much pro-Russian, Russian, but the other sense, it created a separate ideology of modern nationalism, which finally turned to be very anti-Russian, so to say. And it's to a large extent explain why Ukraine still extend themselves as such a peculiar situation between East and West, between Russia and the European Union, so to say, and still struggling to find a way. Even so, I would say that for the last 10 years, it seems like there's a large consensus among the Ukrainians that they have to go west and to leave the Russian world behind. But to conclude, if I may to conclude somehow, I would say that when we look in Ukrainian history and Ukrainian identity, more often than not, we have a very strange and wrong picture. Because let me just put it this way, everything you know about Ukrainian history most likely is wrong. Because we are, say, under a spell of Russian imperial and Ukrainian nationalist myth. Therefore, we believe that among differences, the difference between Ukraine and Russia, there's most of the language character, since Ukrainians speak Ukrainians and Russians speak Russians, therefore this has made difference. It's not. It's not. Means the religion is that much difference, so to say. Because with religiously, Ukraine is still much part of the Orthodox world, Slavic Orthodoxy. Even so, they move below the space. My point is that the main difference between Ukraine and Russia is not in language or in the religion. The main difference, crucial difference, is in different political traditions, which means that you'd never have a tradition of a strong state in Ukraine. Ukrainians tend to dislike, distrust, to be disloyal to the state. It's very much result of this Polish West tradition, which I say. But basically, I would say that Ukraine tends to be all the time much more organized, civic organized, than Belarus or Russia. And therefore, I have a two Maidans, so to say. So basically, I'm saying again, the main difference is political traditions. So if I may put it very simply, but not probably too simply, to illustrate this difference between Ukraine and Russia, this mostly in politics is that there could be hardly Putin in Ukraine, and there could be hardly victorious Maidan in Russia. So they departing politically, so to say. And therefore, I believe nowadays and historically, Ukraine belongs more to the space when still there is democracy, when there's some kind of rights, and the kind of the thing that I mentioned in my presentation. To sum up, to wrap up, now I move again to the religious dimension. One of the fundamental feature of Ukrainian history and culture is multiculturalism. It's not the banal word, it's a fact. Just give you the idea, we have 3 or 4, I'm confused all this, 3 Orthodox churches in Ukraine. I mean the Moscow Patriarchate, Kyiv Patriarchate, and Greek Catholic Church, which is also Orthodox Church. You have a very strong presence of the Jewish history and Jewish traditions historically. You have Crimean Tatars, you have Protestants, you have Karaites, name it, so to say. So in a sense, many people say that Ukraine is neither very much like Russia or Europe. Since borderland status, it more resembles the United States in terms of the multiculturalism and religious diversity. And more importantly, that still it's very much, I would say, the conflictious territory without a doubt, German conflicts, but these conflicts don't turn into the violent stage. If Ukraine is left on its own, Ukrainian elites tend to compromise and resolve the conflict peacefully. If there would be not Russian interference, I believe that even 214 crisis would bring to some kind of the, not probably the perfect, but still a kind of compromise. But in a sense, I would say that even talking about Ukraine is Europe, Ukraine is not because it's not Russia, because of Russian imperialism, because it's given the extreme diversity. You could hardly find a country with such a diversity as Ukraine. And I would say that it provides some kind of the problems, because you have to look for the consensus, you have to start compromises, the transformation is rather slow because of that. But in other sense, I would say it's also a great asset, because it's made the country democratic by default. And you could escape such scenario like in Belarus or Russia nowadays. Again, I could not make any prediction about Ukraine, because you know there is historians are not very good even about telling about the past, so what they could tell about the future. But basically speaking, I'm rather optimist than pessimist, because I believe the Ukraine is moving in the right direction, but given historical past, this movement would take very long. I'd be rather slow, rather than fast like it was in case of Poland or other countries. So at this point, I would like to finish my short presentation, probably not too short, and I will invite you for questions and comments, if I may.